Okay, so now we're recording. What we're going to do today, 24th of September, is we're going to continue our discussion of the physical processes that are driving global Earth ecosystems. And specifically, we want to talk about the biogeochemical cycling, which we alluded to in the brief discussion on Tuesday, and which is discussed more thoroughly in the chapter. But I want to bring out a couple of aspects of biogeochemical cycles using examples from the carbon and nitrogen cycles. And I also want to place elemental cycling, or cycling of material nutrients that are defined by their elemental formula, with other ways of expressing nutrient cyclings or understanding essential nutrients. I'll also talk about limiting factors and then some of the issues around that. We'll try to break out then pretty quickly into our separate groups, and the groups will be continuing their discussion of the article that we read on Tuesday and answer the questions that were spelled out in the second part of that assignment. So should have ample time to come to some conclusions, and then we'll reassemble probably around 1:20, 1:25, 1:30, and we'll have a group discussion, and I'll call on different teams to describe what they concluded based on their analysis of that article. And then, the teams will be, of course, other members will be able to participate in that discussion. And so that's what we have on tap for today. Let me plunge right into my lecture. So Tuesday rather, we talked about major geologic cycles, and we looked at the way in which materials move around the Earth. And earlier we said that the Earth system is, relatively speaking, open system for energy, but it's, relatively speaking, a closed system for material. But that material is not static, it's constantly moving and transitioning between different phases and different components of the Earth system. And by the Earth system, I include not just the biosphere, but also the deep Earth, because as we'll see, that does drive cycles which are absolutely essential over the long term for the continued existence of the Earth ecosystem. So the major cycles that we identified on Tuesday were the hydrologic cycle, or the rain cycle, the water cycle, this is one of the more complete material cycles on the planet. It's also one of the more rapid. There's a constant motion of water vapor and liquid water onto and off of Earth's surfaces, into and out of the Earth ocean. And so that all of these cycles move these essential biogeochemical components that are necessary for life. So the hydrologic cycle, leads to a lot of erosion on land. There are chemical changes, which are also cause the rocks to interact with the atmosphere. Rain tends to decompose rocks, and that decomposition, particularly of silicate rocks, has the result of the absorption of CO2 out of the atmosphere in order to drive those chemical reactions. And that movement of CO2 out of the atmosphere into the geosphere, subsequent runoff into the ocean, deposition of sediments into the ocean, is also a part of the process that removes or sequesters carbon in its global circulation. The rock cycle has this sort of rapid movement of water and air, of atmosphere and air, water, but then this contributes to longer term movements. So, and then all these processes, life gets involved with all these processes. So to the geologic cycles, we add a component of bio. So biological processes become essential. So matter moves along with organism, ecosystems, and the abiotic environment. And when we talk about biogeochemical cycling, we're talking about interactions between the different components, biological, chemical, and so forth. There are major cycles. These major cycles comprise some of the most important elements: carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and water. And with water, we could identify two major elements, hydrogen and oxygen, that are components here.
Hey,
So
Professor.
we can define essential elemental nutrients as the big six. And you'll see this term, it's used very often. So these are the six most important of
Professor
the...
McDonald, are you
Yes?
trying to show us a PowerPoint? Because we don't see one, just in case.
Oh, okay. Got this.
Yeah, we see you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I can see it, but you can't. All right, well, let me go back.
We see a geyser.
You see a geyser, right? Well, I thought that was appropriate to our topic today in terms of talking about geologic processes. Okay, so I started by showing you this slide here, and said that these major components were moving, and then we made this point by showing the slide from the book, and then I switched to this table, which shows you the big six nutrient elements, and these are hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, sulfur, and phosphorus. Now, these elements all have different chemical properties, and the chemical properties result in them being able to combine into different sorts of compounds, and these compounds have different physical and physical-chemical properties, which allow them to move through these Earth biogeochemical cycles in different ways. And so the phase that these elements can assume has a critical influence over how they are able to move through the Earth system. So hydrogen and oxygen are clearly can be present. Water can be present in gaseous, aqueous, and geologic phases. So obviously in the atmosphere, you can have CO2, oxygen, and water. You can have dissolved oxygen, dissolved CO2, and then water is a component of rocks. Hydrogen and oxygen is a component of the geosphere, are very widely understood. Nitrogen is an extremely abundant compound, but its natural form in the atmosphere, N2, poses special challenges for organisms which need nitrogen or nitrogen compounds in order to synthesize and build their components. Sulfur is another major element, and phosphorus is another. I got this wrong. I switched the no and the yes. So I guess we could say that sulfur doesn't move in a bioavailable phase as a gaseous component. Sulfur is not transferred in the atmosphere. And then phosphorus, which is an essential component of necessary for plant growth, it doesn't have compounds that can cycle either in gaseous or aqueous phases. And so this poses special limits on the availability of phosphorus. Phosphorus is typically mined from marine deposits, and including geologically fossil marine deposits. We can also define nutrients in terms of how essential they are for life. Macronutrients, chemical elements are here, but these elements are combined into compounds, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, other compounds, calcium, sodium, potassium, magnesium, chloride. These are listed as macronutrients because they're required in larger quantities compared to micronutrients. So macronutrients typically provide energy, synthesis for proteins, fats, and so forth. And micronutrients are necessary very often to support cellular metabolism. So the cellular processes within living organisms require the presence or require some supply of essential nutrients in much smaller compounds, much smaller quantities. Vitamins are a good example. Vitamins act as coenzymes or cofactors in many cellular processes within the body. And we all know that if we, for example, are deprived of particular vitamins, micronutrient vitamins, that there can be a decline in health and ultimately viability. So we can define the essential components for life in terms of chemical descriptions. We can talk about their molecular and elemental characteristics, and we can also consider, how these how these compounds are expressed and utilized by living organisms. And so how do these things move? I said, that atmospheric circulation obviously is playing a huge role. So we're talking about movement of water vapor, and then also carbon and oxygen compounds within the atmosphere. So this motion, this transfer via the atmospheric routes is extremely important. And these are driven by these massive movements of air controlled by the heating gradient of the Earth. And we get similar processes deriving from ocean currents, and these ocean currents also move nutrient material around in very large volumes. The ocean is particularly important for taking up CO2 in recent times, because CO2 is accumulating to dangerous levels within the atmosphere, and buffering of that accumulation by the ocean has been critical in so far limiting some of the negative impacts of greenhouse effect associated with excess carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. The ocean conveyor belt, this is a long-term oceanic cycle, as opposed to that that's interacting, and this long-term cycle is critical for movement of heat and climate factors. We haven't really discussed in great deal the long-term cycle, the largest and most protracted cycle that affects the availability of nutrients, elemental nutrients across the Earth. And this, of course, is what's called the Wilson cycle or supercontinent cycle. And in this process, the heat at the core of the Earth is being released on the surface of the Earth, and this creates convection currents, or we believe that it creates convection currents. And these convection currents, in a very slow and controlled fashion for the last 1.5 billion years, 2 billion years, have been very gradually opening up ocean basins and then causing continents to collide. So this is the Wilson or supercontinental cycle. It's named in honor of Tuzo Wilson, who was the first scientist to recognize and describe this. So the early processes are rifting of a continental landmass due to pressure and release of material from the inside of the Earth. That tends to spread the two continents apart, opening up an ocean basin. And so the continents are driven apart, and the ocean basins are driven apart. At the active end of the active side of an ocean basin, the oceanic crust subducts underneath the continental crust. It's driven down underneath the continental crust. This produces sort of many kinds of impacts, including mountain building, volcanism, and so forth. And eventually the two continental land masses come back together. The cycle starts over. The cycle has a period of about 500 million years, and over the entire history of Earth, it's repeated about 8 or 9 times. All of life, we live in the Phanerozoic era. The Phanerozoic era describes that geologic period during which organisms, complex organisms, multicellular organisms, have arisen, developed, evolved, and produced massive changes across the globe, including the arrival of human species and the collection of plants and animals that we're familiar with today. The question, so I've talked about the different types of material cycles and how do these cycles control nutrient cycling. Now, there are a number of discussions within the chapter, and I expect you to be familiar with these, that talk about the different macronutrients, the big 6. But I'm going to focus on 2 nutrient cycles in particular, the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, because they illustrate different factors. And they also speak to how the human population is interacting. So in terms of the the carbon cycle, we've talked about trophic interactions, the production and consumption of carbon organic compounds. And so we're familiar with synthesis. Photosynthesis, of course, is causing a cycling of removal of CO2 from the atmosphere and incorporation of that CO2 into organic materials. And this is describing how CO2 is combined with water using energy from the sun to make simple sugars. These sugars are then the pre-components for many, many complex cellular processes that produce the different physical components of plant organisms. This process can be reversed for heterotrophic consumption of this organic material. And so here's a cycle. We see that the CO2 moves into organic compounds, and when these compounds are eaten, the material is returned. Some of it is incorporated, and some of it is returned to the atmosphere via respiration. A similar sort of heterotrophic process is decomposition. An example of decomposition is fermentation, and this again is producing CO2 with the production of heat and their byproducts, including in this case alcohol. Alcohol being a familiar product of fermentation. There's also one other extremely important component of the carbon cycle, and that is combustion. And the human population, as we know it today, is entirely dependent on the combustion of fossil fuels for our food supply, for our transportation, for the way in which our society is organized. And so this, this combination of fuel, in this case, I'm talking about fossil carbon material derived ultimately from plant production in the geologic past. By combining this with oxygen, we get heat, and that produces CO2 as well as water. Essentially the same return as we would get by reversing through respiration. But combustion is essential for the human population. This has led to an accumulation because fossil fuel use is so widespread and has increased to such high level. The release of CO2 into the atmosphere has been increasing steadily over time. If we compare this to historic records, the last couple of 100 years have produced an exponential increase in CO2. This graph is out of date by several factors. We're now well over 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, and I don't have to tell you that this accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere produces greenhouse effects, which are deleterious. So the carbon cycle, as we see it, contains these components. All life systems are dependent upon, some being part of some component of the carbon cycle, and human beings have hijacked a particular component of the carbon cycle to produce global scale changes in climate. Well, I'm going to talk also about the nitrogen cycle. And in the nitrogen cycle, it's important to, it introduces us to an important concept, which is that of a limiting factor. So I said that all of these nutrients, all these chemical nutrients are necessary for life. And without, if one of them suddenly becomes unavailable, then life is no longer possible. But if we consider a population, a limiting factor, any limiting factor is a variable in that system that causes a notable change in output or another measure of a type of system. So we're talking about organisms in this case, and so the limiting factor, produces the pyramidal shape of organisms going up from producers to consumers and so forth. Populations typically depend on a variety of factors, for example, the availability of nutrients, and it's almost always the case that the factor present in the smallest quantity will be the factor that limits the population growth. Now, this factor, and I'm talking about nutrients in this context, but the factor can also be habitat, the availability of substrate, and so forth. But this concept of limiting factors can help us to understand how the nitrogen cycle affects human beings. So the atmosphere is about 70 8% nitrogen. So there is abundant nitrogen on the planet. However, that nitrogen is present in a molecular form, N2, and these triple bonds are very difficult to break. They don't spontaneously break, and in this form, N2, nitrogen is not available for the synthetic processes that are synthesis processes that are needed for life. So for living organisms to exist, they somehow have to access nitrogen in some other form, typically fixed with hydrogen. Okay, well, nitrogen fixation can occur naturally without human or living intervention. Factors such as volcanic eruption, very importantly, lightning in the atmosphere can break these triple bonds and make ammonia or other forms of fixed nitrogen available for life. Early in Earth history, nitrogen became a limiting factor for the protobacteria and protoorganisms that were living in the atmosphere. So nitrogen fixation, the ability of bacteria to fix nitrogen, actually was one of the earliest crises, the earliest components of evolution that really allowed life to expand beyond this natural limit. So what does nitrogen do? Well, the nitrogen cycle, if we describe it chemically, progresses from this atmospheric nitrogen bound together by these triple bonds. When the triple bonds are broken, you form these ammonium or ammonia, and this is then available for nitrification. So fixation, the double bonded elemental nitrogen in the atmosphere, gaseous in form, fixed into ammonia or ammonium, and then nitrified or by bacteria, and then this nitrified compounds can be used by plants for their synthesis, and the plants can be eaten by organisms. We can express this nitrogen cycle in terms of process by looking at the nitrification. So this is the nitrification. Fixation is happening. We start with an ammonia compound. We proceed to nitrification as a bacterial oxidation of that. These produce nitrate ions, which can be taken up in plant proteins. It also produces some nitrogen gas. Plants die, and they're either consumed by organisms or broken down by decomposition processes. So this is the natural nitrogen cycle. And human beings, of course, suffer from limits in the nitrogen cycle. And I wanted to illustrate that by looking at the traditional nitrogen cycle in agriculture. And what I'm showing you here is actually a picture from my heritage. This is a picture of a farm near Leipzig in Germany. This is when my maternal grandfather was born and raised on this farm. They had a total of 17 children, 11 of whom lived to adulthood. And this is the oldest of them. This is Fritz Remmler. My grandfather was the youngest in this family, and Walter Remmler. But Fritz Remmler inherited the farm as the oldest person. This picture, we think, was taken in about 1912. I visited this farm a couple of years ago. It's still existent, and the owner was kind enough to let me make a copy of this photograph. I'm showing it not to talk about my family history, but to think about what they're doing in this picture. So if we look here, we can see how people lived. You get a sort of a picture of how people lived, several hundred years, 100 years ago, 100 plus years ago. It's interesting to note that the children, this is a relatively cold day. You can see that the clothing is flapping around, so it's windy. The kids are barefoot. The women are wearing wooden clogs and woolen socks, and only the man has these more expensive leather boots on. What are they doing? Well, they've got a wagon here, another wagon ready to go. And what's in this wagon? Well, what's in this wagon is manure. And this is they had a number of livestock, including dairy cattle, but also horses that lived in this barn here, and they very carefully preserved the or compiled the manure produced by this livestock. And in the spring of the year, they would gather up this manure and, very importantly, spread it out on the agricultural fields in order to provide fertilization for the crops that they were growing. So this was an essential activity for early agriculture. However, there are limits to how much productivity you can get by this natural process of fertilization from manure, from animal waste. And by 1910, in the early 1900s, it was already the case that Europe was no longer able to produce enough food agriculturally to support their populations. And the result of not having enough agricultural production to support the populations resulted in periodic famines. So at many times during the 18th and early 1900s, the food supply would fail due to a bad winter or other factors, and the result would be starvation to the point of death by thousands of Europeans. Well, what was the solution to this? The solution to this population growth outstripped food supply during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The exhaustion of soils, so the overproduction of soils, also limited the ability of fertilization by manure. And already in 1850 or thereabouts, Europeans were searching around for other sources of nitrate or nitrogen fertilizer. They exploited such things as guano islands in South America, and for a little while, guano, the waste of birds, was actually mined and brought back to Europe to drive agricultural fertilization. The ultimate solution to the nitrogen limitation was something called the Haber-Bosch technique for artificially fixing nitrogen out of the air. And this is this process, the Haber-Bosch process, is driven by very high usage of fossil fuels. So this is a diagram of the process here. And so this process of nitrogen limitation, nitrogen fixation, came into practice particularly in Germany. This was a German invention, and it was adopted subsequently by other countries. And so with abundant use of fossil fuels, they were able to drive this chemical process and produce ammonia from the air. And this ammonia could then be nitrified and used for fertilizer. So this solved the nitrogen fixation problem. Oops. Something happened. So this, solved the nitrogen problem, but that solution to the nitrogen problem is not the end of the story. So if we look at the agriculture cycle in modern times, the agricultural cycle is driven by chemical fertilizers. Chemical fertilizers most typically contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, roughly in this numerical order. And nitrogen is produced by the Haber-Bosch process that I described. The phosphorus is obtained from mineral deposits, mining deposits. And so this input into the agricultural cycle is absolutely essential. But even still with that, the waste products of animals could drive this process. So traditional agriculture keeps animals near the crops. So in the picture that I showed from my ancestral family farm, the animals were right next to the farm fields. Modern agricultural process, and we'll talk more about this later in the course, separates these two components of agriculture. So animals that we eat are typically raised in one form or another of a feedlot. And a good example would be the production of chickens for meat and eggs, and then they're raised in these giant industrial settings, and hundreds of thousands of birds are very quickly reared to maturity and then killed for meat. But what that does is it creates huge amounts of waste product, which then don't have any sort of natural return to the environment. Same thing happens with feedlot for pigs and cattle. So the modern system splits this up, and the result is an accumulation of nitrogen, and in the atmosphere. And this is directly related. This consumption of nitrogen can be directly related to the growth of the population. So, I said that the growth of human population was dependent on, the ability to burn fossil fuel. It's also related to the ability to fix and utilize nitrogen. Okay, well, so that's about what I had. There are many other examples, and we could do a whole lecture on this, but I would like to leave enough time for you all to split into your groups. However, let me go ahead and see if we have any questions from the students about the material that I've covered in the last 15 minutes or so. Any questions? Please, there has to be some questions. I'll look in the chat here. Darren, go ahead, Darren.
Nitrogen fixation, could you phrase it as the conversion of nitrogen into either ammonia or ammonium, or is it specifically ammonia? It's
either. It happens in different ways, and there are rapid cycling between ammonia and ammonium. But fixation is the addition of the hydrogen atom essentially to the nitrogen. So it's fixed with by incorporation of a hydrogen atom into that compound.
I got a little tricked on question 8 on the reading quiz, because it gives the chemical formula for ammonium after the word ammonia. So I thought it was sort of a trick question, but once I went back, I figured they were probably interchangeable. Obviously the formulas are different though.
Yeah, I think we corresponded about that, didn't we, Darren, or somebody else?
I had mentioned it, but
yeah.
Okay, so it is either one.
It is either one. There's a discussion in the book. There's a discussion of that on page 60. On the top of the page, it talks about the two compounds. But you're right. It is a little confusing. If there's great interest, we could meet and I could walk you through the nitrogen cycle.
No, so that's fine. I was just curious about whether it was interchangeable ammonia or ammonium. Thank you.
Okay. All right, great. Well, I see we only have 66 people present. Are there any other questions over the lecture material before we split into our breakout groups?
I just had a quick question.
Yeah, Kurt.
I mean, so far, so it sounds like more and more nitrogen is being consumed, but
accumulating.
Okay, so it's still, but is it still staying at the same ratio or level in the atmosphere? Like, is the level of nitrogen in our atmosphere not?
There's been a slight increase, very slight though, because it's so present in such overwhelming proportion in the atmosphere that it's difficult to measure. But there is more nitrogen in the atmosphere than there used to be before we started our process of Haber-Bosch. And there's also a great deal more nitrate and ammonia deposition in the biosphere. So we are looking at an accumulation of nitrogen. If it were cycling back into the atmosphere, that would be okay, because this could just be a component of the atmosphere. Unfortunately, a lot of the nitrogen that's removed from the atmosphere is deposited as nitrate or nitrate compounds. That makes sense?
So we need to, I guess if we continued like this, we would need to come up with a way to use nitrogen so that it,
yeah, well, I mean, it's not as an acute a problem, but, if you think about, for example, the dead zone in the ocean, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. One component in creating these, and a better way to talk about dead zones is talk about hypoxic regions in the ocean. There are many, the Gulf of Mexico is one example of a dead zone or a hypoxic area, but there are many in marine systems around the planet. And one of the principal drivers of these dead zones is the accumulation of nitrate compounds due to agricultural runoff. So deposition of nitrogen into the ocean and into the ocean sediments, is an issue which impacts the ecosystem functioning and ecosystem services.
And if they, last thing, if they, the way we do, like you were saying, our agriculture and our livestock now, what those animals produce as far as like dung and all that, that's not any good, you said, as fertilizer?
Oh no, it still works just fine as
It
fertilizer.
still is?
But the activities are physically separated. So
Yeah, but do we take those and still use them as fertilizers, or do those food places just get rid of that as waste?
they try to get rid of it, but it's a major problem, and you can approach that problem in different areas. There are manure lagoons across, all of North Carolina, South Carolina, where there's lots of chicken production. And so they, a chicken producing, so I don't even really want to call it a farm because of, a farm has a sort of different connotation, but chicken production produces huge amounts of chicken waste, and that chicken waste is highly nitrogenous. Chickens don't produce urine and feces separately. They produce a single component, and this waste gets put into lagoons, literally big ponds full of chicken shit. And that's a huge issue when you get flooding. So, some of the recent hurricanes that have caused flooding on the eastern seaboard have had the result of releasing huge amounts of, from these nutrient manure lagoons into the water system. And it has an immediate toxicity, and then it has a secondary impact on, the way in which ecosystems are able to function, particularly in the ocean. And the same applies to feedlots. There's a lot of manure concentrated in small areas due to our agricultural, the mode of agricultural production, industrialized agriculture, as opposed to sort of, human scale, traditional farm agriculture. So, a farm, typically you think of a sort of a classic farm, that has a couple of cows, a couple of pigs, some chickens, a vegetable garden, maybe fields of oats or whatever, and these are all together in the same physical area. So people are able to use and want to use that manure as fertilizer for their crops. But that, at industrial scale, that completely breaks down. And most of the industrial scale food production, meat production, produces these kinds of inequalities. All right, let me go ahead and, if there are no more other questions, I'll go ahead and break you into your rooms and then address that. So I will open all rooms. And I have to go through, go ahead and get into your rooms, please. So go ahead, and then Carolina.
Planeteers.
Planeteers. Carrie, only start out and only clams. Sharon, you go into aquanauts or aquatic junkies? I can't remember.
Aquatic junkies.
Aquatic junkies. Delia.
Planeteers.
Planeteers. Emily.
The Wayfinders.
The Wayfinders. And last but not least, Catherine, where do you go?
Team title.
Team title. Okay, someday we'll get this worked out. How you doing, beaches?
Hello.
Got everything figured out?
getting set up now.
Okay. All right, well, I do want to leave enough time for discussion here. So, go ahead and try to get this done. I'm going to probably put us back into our regular session in about 15 minutes. So we'll have time for presentations from the different teams and then discussion by everybody. Okay? So about 15 minutes. Thanks. Hello, Aquanauts, just checking in. I'm going to put you back into the main session in about 15 minutes. So try to move through this, these questions and get yourself situated to, join the general discussion, pretty quickly because I want to leave enough time for overall interactions. Okay?
Excellent.
About
Thank you.
15 minutes then.
I'm trying to think of a scientific question.
Oh, the paper was about how okay, yeah, I did read this. I got scared that I didn't read it.
We have a visitor, by the way.
Okay.
We did have a quick question for you, Dr. McDonald. About narrowing down, I know this is off topic real quick, but about narrowing down our group project to permafrost. Do you have any recommendations as to what we should really focus in on? Because we're kind of having trouble of, like what should we really focus on? What aspect of permafrost? Your volume is not on, sir.
Muted. You need to define what permafrost is, where it's found, what the geologic cycling of permafrost is, and then, what the dynamics of the current extent of permafrost is across the planet, and the change in that. I mean, there's something like 50 to 100 teragrams of carbon locked up in the permafrost. So, you have this, dreadful feedback cycle, a feedback loop, where the melting of permafrost releases methane and carbon dioxide, but methane is a very intense greenhouse gas. It has many fold, like something like 60 times more warming properties than CO2 does. And so that tends to drive the temperature up, which melts the permafrost more. And so there's a positive feedback loop in the melting of permafrost, which is pretty ominous in terms of the greenhouse effect and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So there's plenty of scientific questions, and if you start looking up permafrost, you'll see different aspects. You know, I would focus on that, and I can tell you that a professor but there are graduate students that are working on permafrost, and you could get some advice from them. So if you'll email me, I'll send you some comments and contacts so that you could talk to some of the graduate students who would have direct experience on permafrost. Okay?
Good, thank you.
Dr. Spencer is the professor on campus here who, in the EOS department, who, you know, his students, some of his students are working on permafrost and melting glaciers, and you could certainly talk to them about and get some pointers on that. Okay?
Do you know when the new due date for milestone 2 will be? Since I think online it shows like the 28th.
I want you to get a draft on milestone 2 and on the 28th. Most people are, you know, then we'll do a revision, so we'll probably extend the final due date. But I want everybody to have at least a draft of their milestone 2 turned in by then. Okay, we only got a few minutes left in breakout room, so let me leave you and you can finalize. Carrie, are you in the main session? Carrie, can you hear me? No. Homeboys, so you're kind of depleted today. You only have 2 team members present? Oh, there's 3. Okay. Remember, you got to have at least 3. Otherwise, I take off points. So if people aren't showing up to class, you got to get on their case.
I
So,
think one of our members just wasn't added to the group.
oh, really? Who's that?
Berta Garcia.
Oh, I'll put her in right now.
But we were talking to her through a group chat, and we're still working on it together.
Okay, great. All right. She should be able to be in there now. Berta, are you present?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So just a few more minutes, and we'll be getting back together to talk about the migration article.
Sounds good.
Hi, cabbages. How are you doing?
Good.
You good, I think.
All right, great. So just a few more minutes, and I'm going to put everybody back in the main session. So we, you know, get your talking points ready to go. And I don't know who I'm going to call on, but you might be on tap. And in any event, it's good if you can, you know, if there's a discussion and you can bring in some other points or some other literature or some other ideas in the general discussion, that's great too. Okay? So
Okay.
probably about another 5 minutes.
Okay.
Hello? Anybody here?
Yes, they're all here.
Oh, okay, you have your videos hidden or something? Hi. Okay, I'm just checking in. Any questions? You got at least 3 people present. That's great. So about just another couple minutes and we'll be getting back into the main session, and I'll be calling on groups, and please be ready to either present or ask questions. Okay?
What exactly are we presenting about?
Well, you have the assignment for this week, and you had questions to answer. And so I'd like you to go through the questions and tell us what you came up with. And then also just trying to react generally. There was some pretty specific things that were focused on by that article, but that sort of opens up the door for wider things. The situation in Florida, very different from the situation in California, but also related in terms of the flooding, and it actually gets brought up. Where else does this apply? Are there other things besides flooding and fires that produce potentially large-scale movements? Are there international examples of this? Sort of what can you find out? Okay.
Good. Sounds good.
All right, just a few minutes. I guess everybody can hear me now. We're back in the main session. And I wanted to invite the individual teams to go through the material in this assignment. So you all read this article. I would assume that everybody sort of found this article as impactful as I did. It raises a lot of very serious questions about environmental stability, about security, of things that we just sort of take for granted. I mean, you sort of assume if you have a house and a job that that's going to be there, and both fires and floods and big storms and things like that can abruptly obliterate that sense of environmental security, and with the result that some people are going to be displaced, and the displacement has is occurring in the United States. We don't really talk about it. Talk about people who are displaced in this way as being refugees, and one of the questions for you is, should we use this? All right. So on Tuesday, you went through and you looked at, who was affected by the West Coast wildfires. What is the impact on people's communities? Is this a permanent thing, or is this a cyclic thing? What are the 2 different environmental factors here? have the potential to produce large-scale displacement? And should we use refugee? Is that an appropriate term, or is that too loaded? You've gotten back together and said, what are the scientific questions that we need to answer in order to try to find some solution to these problems? And what are the policy or legal steps that should be taken? What are the moral responsibility and so forth? So I'm going to call on a team here. And as always, I'm spinning a wheel and choosing this team at random. And so when if I call your team, please, and I'll stop sharing here. If I call your team, so I'm calling on the aquatic junkies. So would all of the aquatic junkies please activate your videos and then come on and respond to the prompts in the Thursday session for the assignment. So you're looking at scientific questions that need to be answered, and other sort of findings that you have. Go ahead, team aquatic junkies. What have you got?
Okay, so I'm gonna address problem 3 first, which is the moral responsibility that people living in unimpacted areas have with climate refugees.
Yeah.
So people that live in unimpacted areas will likely experience an increase in population within their cities, and there's going to be like a higher increase in competition within the job market. So, and if those conditions aren't met in a timely fashion, the homeless rates will also increase within the city. So it's just overall a decrease in well-being within all citizens within the city when there's an unexpected increase in population.
Okay. And what are the moral responsibilities, though? I mean, is this something that we should just allow, or is it better to sort of protect our own interests? What are the morals? What's the morality of how people who have environmental security, or whose resources and habitat is not threatened or not immediately threatened by this? What responsibility do they have? So if 5,000 people from California wanted to relocate in Tallahassee, should we just accept them, or what would that be? Go ahead, Penelope. What do you think?
Well, honestly, I think in America everyone has a very individualistic point of view on a lot of things. It's it's been proven through all the climate issues that have arisen. So in terms of moral responsibility, they're definitely there. It's not to say that everyone actually takes them into account, because people are very individualistic, but you definitely have to deal with whether you want to feel a sense of discomfort in order to save other people's lives, because displacement can become there's a decrease in health within homeless populations. There's an increase in diseases and stuff. So it's an issue of morality, in the sense of, are you willing to sacrifice your discomfort for the saving of another person? And that's up to each person. I can't completely generalize a whole population. That's depends on people's religious points of view and the way that they're raised. So I think they're very individualistic.
Okay. Does anybody want to?
I agree with her on that regard, that it would be difficult for an entire population, say Tallahassee. It would have to be something passed in law that says, here we are, we're going to allow these people whether you like it or not, because Penelope's right in the fact that it's morally, it's up, the individual is going to, you have one person that says, yeah, absolutely, come on in. And then the person living right next door says, no, we don't want them anywhere near us. They need to stay the hell in California. That's where they're from. But I think a lot of people would be less likely to migrate away if we could, through public education and personal responsibility, a lot of these things can be mitigated to begin with. So I think that's an important step in areas that are wildfires, for example. Better education, better personal responsibility, like say, you know, when you go camping, you know, make sure that the fire is out and make sure that you're educated about the importance. I mean, wildfires are a natural existing thing and they're important, but when they're, you know, out of hand like they are now, that's the hard part about a scientific question, you know, how much is too much, number one, but I think a lot of it, just public education and, you know, take responsibility for your actions is gonna help a lot of these problems.
Okay, I have some reaction to that, but does anybody else in the group or anybody in the class as a whole want to chime in on this question of you know, the moral impact of or the moral obligation of people to take care of those who are affected by climate change and these kinds of emergencies?
I just also had an example. I mean, this could go for impacted areas too, but I just think that your own responsibility to like maybe conserve resources and stuff like that. Like for example, like in my county, like we could only water our lawn on Tuesdays and Fridays. And I just think that like, you know, it's up to you to follow that. And, you know, some people are going to water their lawn every day, but then some people are also going to, you know, like go by those conditions.
Okay. Any other comments on this from the group or from the
I don't feel like this should be an issue of morality. I feel like this is more of a policy issue altogether. This is something that the national government will have to decide and deal with. They're going to have to put aside money for this, and I don't think they should turn to individual people to make this decision because we're all going to be dealing with it.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. I think that, you know, sort of says, well, wait a minute, you know, we don't act just as individuals, but in this country, at least, we have a democratic process for deciding how we're going to react. Okay, but let me open the envelope a little bit, or expand the thing that we're considering. If you'll recall, in 2018, in particular, there was a lot of concern about the caravan. Do you all remember the caravan of 2018? And that was you know, large groups of refugees, and the size of the groups and, you know, everything was kind of emphasized because of the political ramifications of the caravan. But why were people moving in the first place? Why were they leaving, you know, Guatemala, El Salvador? Drought. So, you know, there was a specific environmental factor, and people who depend entirely on sustainable agriculture, you know, can't survive, literally don't have any food to eat. And if they go into the cities in their, you know, in a developing country, they're not going to find any better situation. So, you know, the gradient, you know, would direct them towards the United States, where resources are more abundant and where, in fact, there are opportunities for employment, you know, if we're willing to allow people to work. And they arrive at the border, and people are allowed to apply for sanctuary. The law already on the book says that if somebody has a reasonable fear of persecution due to their ethnic or political persuasion, they can ask for sanctuary in the United States. They're supposed to be allowed to do that. Well, you know, the present administration has interpreted that law in particular ways and made it very difficult for people to get sanctuary. What I'm asking is, you know, on a global scale, you know, what's going to happen if, you know, not just thousands of people from areas that are burned out or flooded out of the United States, but areas, you know, entire countries or entire regions, you know, face emergencies. And that's not an impossible factor. So let me just put that out. Okay, you know, the Aquatic Junkies, let me call on somebody else so another team can weigh in on this. Only clams. So only clams. Why don't you, everybody else, please discontinue your video, and why don't the clams give us their perspective on this question. So only clams, only clams.
Hello. So we thought that this is a really big issue, that there's gonna be refugees, and how do we deal with that? Like, how do we start dealing with that, as in there's gonna be a strain into places that are not already strained. Say if people come here to Florida, our water resources are gonna be strained, and how do we deal with that? So that's what I was thinking, that we're gonna have to adapt and develop new strategies and technologies just to get everybody the resources that they need.
Right. And how do we get there, though? You know, what is the, you know, so we're kind of focusing on this because it's sort of the nexus of the challenge here. We understand the science of this. We understand that climate change is driving all these processes, but, you know, there are particular ways that we don't really understand, but we can see as a general trend that these problems are here and they're getting worse. And, you know, we can anticipate certain kinds of challenges and pressures taking place. And we have examples of, you know, mass movements, starvation, political unrest that's been driven by these processes. So we kind of know it's coming. How do we get there? You know, what is the, you know, what is the step? Because I agree with you, Gabriella, that those are the kind of things that need to happen. But I'm just kind of wondering how they happen.
I think policy is really important in this, that we have to have restrictions, because if we are able to do things now in the present, then we can have our resources last for a longer time. And then maybe we don't have the technology right now, but once this starts happening, the technology might come, like maybe desalination will be more efficient. And then we can find ways to provide people with clean water that way. But definitely there needs to be a realization now instead of when we have no water disposable to us.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that?
I had something kind of to share with the question of like how, kind of with the technology.
Yeah.
Because when that was raised, I found this article that came out yesterday about migration and mitigating climate change. And the article says how the United Nations has the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which provides farmers with like new technologies for new markets, in the same with the UN also having the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which allows them to go over to countries and get signatures for easing the cause of migration and making it safer across countries. But we, as the United States, voted against that. So I do have like that we do have some technologies and we are seeing that they're used, but that our country itself is the one that is deciding to not move forward with that, even though we could see that it is greatly impacting areas across.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, you know, we have some, you know, international institutions that would allow us to perhaps move in this direction, you know, through treaty, through foreign aid, through other kinds of collaborations. You know, what do you think? I mean, you know, what do the facts tell us? Are we moving in that direction, or are we moving in a different direction, or are we undecided? Anybody want to comment on that? What direction is the United States going in terms of, you know, this sort of moral responsibility, you know, care? What can we see? Go ahead.
That like, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Joseph. Yeah, go ahead, Joseph.
I think that like part of the country is moving like towards being more moral and like, you know, socially aware and stuff, and then another part is moving against at the same rate. So like we're super divided right now. I feel like there's a part of the country that really, really cares, but you know, people in positions of power right now, we're definitely moving the opposite direction. Right.
Yeah. So that's a, you know, that's a political trend, and it's one of the sort of decisions. And, you know, here we are in this presidential election, and one of the things that's, you know, going to come out of this is sort of what broad course do we take? Do we take one of, you know, greater social responsibility and policy that, you know, would require potentially sacrifice or, you know, changes in lifestyle? Or do we, continue with this value of sort of personal liberty and property values and so forth? So that's a question that's out there.
We don't even have, didn't we just recently, didn't our asylum treaty with Canada just end because they ruled that we're no longer what both of us used to be? Because it's a little confusing, but I mean, that was where we both agree to offer asylum from, I don't remember if it's refugees from the other country or just from any country, or we see the other country as a safe place for refugees. And I think Canada just ruled that we're no longer a safe place, or something like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly the terms. Does anybody know? Has anybody else in the class followed that? I don't recall exactly, but my general sense is that the United States and Canada were in a reciprocal agreement, so that we both agreed that we would provide sanctuary for people who were fleeing persecution or political unrest in their countries, not specifically climate change, but more specifically political unrest. And our country, the ICE policies, ICE policies have essentially stopped recognizing, they've basically shut down the asylum courts, and it's become extremely difficult administratively to get asylum, whereas Canada has remained more accepting, far more accepting of people who are legitimate refugees than we have. And I think Canada may have wanted to end that, but I don't know the specifics of that. That's interesting. You could maybe try to look that up and clarify that. Okay,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I found an article that said that the Canada court rules U.S. not safe for asylum seekers.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, the Safe Third Country Agreement denies refugees the right to enter Canada if they had crossed through another country that offers human rights protections. Since 2004, the U.S. has been designated as a safe country, so any refugees entering Canada through official checkpoints have usually been turned away. But now, I guess Canada would be sending people back to us, but they don't consider us a safe country anymore. And sending someone to us, they see as violating their human rights or their constitutional rights because they feel we're no longer upholding them.
Yeah. Okay, and that's a very significant development, along with many other similar sorts of policy changes that have been implemented, in recent years. So yeah, that's a concern, but none of that really gets to the problem of climate change or refugees from climate, because we're just beginning to recognize that internationally. It's long been understood that the drivers for your refugee status are genocidal activities or ethnic cleansing, that kind of thing, war. That's what historically has produced large-scale migrations. But in our current situation, with climate change and sea level rise, drought, those sorts of factors increasing in severity and occurrence, there can be many more people. So I'm just sort of saying that, we're kind of falling down on the job as a country, and as a country which can lead the rest of the world by example in terms of how we treat political refugees. That problem is going to become a lot more severe if whole populations, as happened in Central America, are displaced or suffering because of climate changes. Okay, so we've talked a lot about that, and we're at the end of the class, but I will, if you'd like to keep the discussion going, I'll stay online until 2 o'clock, because I know sometimes these discussions get cut off. So you're not obliged to stay here. I've talked to aquatic junkies and only clams in terms of asking for policy, and so I'll try to avoid calling on them when we do future discussions, so they get a little bit of a break. But if anybody wanted to chime in on this, react to this, please feel free. Does anybody have any comments?
I did want to say something
Okay,
really quickly. I did notice that the United States
especially with our conservation laws, we are kind of different than the UN. You know, the UN has like the UN Red List for endangered species. We have the Endangered Species Act. You know, we've been kind of like separating ourselves with like from international law. So like with regards to like refugees, you know, with the current pattern that has been happening, it's probably going to get harder and harder for you know, international law to apply to refugees coming into the United States, since we love to separate ourselves and we love to make our own laws over here and, you know, disregard the international law.
Yeah. So, you know, how well, you know, aligned we are. And I guess that's one other thing that's happened, you know, in the recent years is that generally speaking, you know, these international agreements and international institutions have been, you know, weakened or become less important in terms of, you know, how it constrains American policy or U.S. policy. So that's a really good point, Vanessa. Anybody else wanted to comment? Nalia, did you have something to say? Melina, I'm sorry.
I know you're fine. I have a question. So earlier we were kind of talking about the reality, like, is it realistic to say that refugees can all come to this one spot and all that?
Right.
And one of the things being considered was everybody's individual opinions. And isn't it like less realistic to think that we will be considering everybody's individual opinions, because that's just always been impossible?
Yeah, you know, I think, you know, we're talking about refugee status, but generally speaking, you know, I think I think it's fair to say that one of the things that drives, you know, real policy and opinion differences between sort of a liberal point of view and a conservative point of view is, you know, when we look at large scale problems, you know, displacement due to climate change, you know, the steps needed to reverse, you know, the carbonization of the atmosphere, you know, those kinds of changes can't happen at an individual level. We cannot depend on individual choice to make that sort of collective change. And so, you know, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative would be national policy. And we do have national policy, like, for example, you know, the mileage standards for cars, you know, considering carbon dioxide a pollution that can be regulated through the Clean Air Act. Those kinds of considerations. But, you know, there's another branch of political thought in the United States which says, no, we cannot, you know, we can't infringe on individual liberties with the kinds of central planning and regulatory statehood that, you know, that might be necessary. So that's an incredibly difficult, in my opinion, an incredibly difficult problem to try to solve. It's sort of like having to square this circle of, you know, here are these actions that we have to take. And, you know, the longer we wait in taking these actions, the more severe will be the restrictions when eventually we decide, okay, it's, you know, we can't do anything else. But on the other hand, you know, if we start to take those actions, then people who have, you know, vested personal interest or, very importantly, corporate and monetary interests in keeping things the way they are, you know, they start to really resist that. And, you know, I think some of the political polarization that we see in the country, you know, could be defined in those terms. Does anybody agree or disagree with me on that?
I just had another comment.
Sure.
I was thinking, just because, I mean, the way everything is right now, every potential refugee that we take in adds to the problem, because one of our biggest problems right now is that we're trying to get people to do the right things and use renewable things and all that. And our problems are more prevalent in the low income areas of the country. And just the way we are, every refugee would be in that low income area, most likely, and probably for a while. So until we can fix our low income problem and make it to where that is not, I mean, we're all soaking up so much renewables and producing carbon and all that, but it's like once we get a handle on that, which is where refugees would go, then refugees coming into the problem or into the country wouldn't just exacerbate the problem. You know, once we have a solution at the bottom, then you add people to it, and you're adding people to a system that's on its way up or it's working. But right now, they're being added to like our big problem in the system, and they would just be one more low-income consumer. And until we can figure out how to fix that, that's what makes it so hard to let more people in, because we physically have space, but we don't utilize our space right. We don't utilize our housing right. There's plenty of empty housing, I'm sure, that just because people can't afford it or something. So it's like a ladder, you know, it's like.
Well, what I hear you saying is that sort of inequality, you know, is a barrier to, you know, those kinds of solutions, and we almost have to solve our inequality problem before we can start domestically, before we can start looking at inequality internationally and think about that. Well, let me you know, take an opposite point of view. I mean, there are many places in the country where there are deficit shortages of people, you know, for different kinds of occupations. There's a great example, you know, this doesn't apply everywhere, but in Maine, in the state of Maine, you know, there's a increasing proportion of the population is aged, and the people living in nursing homes. And these people, there are not enough nursing home workers to take care of the population of aged people, which is only getting larger. So you have, you know, thousands of refugees, many of whom would be very happy to take on the problem of, you know, nursing home care. There are many thousands of refugees who would happily work agriculturally or do cleanup or many of these things. But we have a sort of a social and legal structure which stops them coming in, you know, because we're afraid, oh, they'll become part of our population. They'll become citizens, and they may vote in ways which, you know, don't favor, you know, one power structure or another.
And I think that's driven by our sense of nationalism.
Right, right, right.
I think that's what keeps the country from wanting other people, is they're like, no, this is us.
Right.
And also that's what's one of the reasons why we're so different, I think, too, as like conservation law, the metric system. I mean, we're all so different. So I think that sense of nationalism has really, really kind of like, you know, put us on our own type of laws and rules that we have trouble kind of understanding other countries and other forms of. And then the other problem that I was thinking is, I mean, this also all boils down to like, how can we quantify an environmental crisis? So on both sides, how can we quantify, you know, what's the damaging being done by the wildfires versus, oh, what would be the damaging by letting refugees, or the social economic gain or benefit or loss, you know, it's that like trying to, you know, compare and contrast something that's really hard to quantify, something that's really hard to fully, you know, understand.
Like which is better, or which, which is
right.
evil or something.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we clearly are, you know, at a tipping point. And I think one of the things, you know, that this American exceptionalism, which I think is what you're talking about, Vanessa, you know, American exceptionalism, you know, is something that, you know, first of all, it becomes a talking point. You know, we're the greatest country that ever lived. We have the best economy. We're so smart. We're so wonderful. I mean, personally, I find it a little bit, you know, big-headed of us to, you know, I mean, like, have you been to Europe?
Right,
you know?
right.
Has anybody been to France? I mean, you know, it's supposedly a socialist country, but a lot of it looks a lot better than, you know, what you can see in a lot of places in this country. So, you know, that American exceptionalism is a lot of times based on you know, incomplete information or experience. But the other part of it is, I think that the pandemic has revealed sort of the downside of American exceptionalism. Sort of, we've gone our own way. You know, we've insisted that people have to be able to choose whether or not they wear masks and go to bars and have parties and, you know, all those things that, you know, oh my God, we wouldn't be Americans if we couldn't do these things. And then we see in this particular circumstance, which is nobody's fault, you know, we didn't ask for this virus, but here it is. You know, there is this challenge, and it's an outgrowth of many things. I mean, the virus didn't just suddenly appear. It came because of, you know, habitat loss and, you know, many things. And so there have been a lot of diseases that have come into the human population because of that. And then, you know, we have to cope with them. And it turns out that the American exceptionalism model is not particularly well equipped for the, you know, kind of homogeneous, harmonious reaction that, you know, has happened in other places. Germany, for example. And Germany is a capitalist society. You know, they have similar resources. People are independent minded, but they were willing to accept limits, you know, very quickly and follow these limits. Now, you know, the virus continues to challenge all societies, but that points that out. And so, you know, I'm kind of depressed by the, you know, okay, if the virus is a trial run for how we respond as a nation to a national challenge, it's kind of discouraging that we haven't been able to do any better. Despite, you know, the president giving us an A++ grade in our response. You know, so I heard a thing on CNN last night where they were saying, okay, you know, if this is an A+, that means it's the best thing that you could possibly do, the best possible response, A++. Well, our A++ performance, the best we can do is to be the worst in the world.
First, yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, that's like, you know, that's kind of a, you know, wow, eye-opening moment, you know, to think about that. And so, you know, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, here we are at 2 o'clock. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll try to do this, you know, so we can, you know, have our conversation continue over into the thing there. But so you all have to turn in what you did for the assignment by 5 o'clock tonight. The milestone 2, I forgot to mention this, but I'll send out an announcement. That remains due on the 28th. But just like with milestone 1, Carrie and I will have conferences with you to formulate, you know, to revise your milestone 2, so everybody stays on track for what you're doing. Okay?
Okay.
All right, everybody. Have a good weekend, and
Yeah.
I'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks, you too, Professor.
Bye-bye.